Imagine walking through the streets of Havana in 1950. The air is thick with humidity, carrying the smell of salt from the nearby sea. And something else, something warm, rich, and unmistakable. It's coming from an open window, from a kitchen no bigger than a hallway, where a woman stirs a pot of black beans over a wood-burning stove, while rice bubbles in another pan right beside it. This is Cuba, and this is food. But before we talk about what Cubans were eating, we need to understand why they were eating it. Because food doesn't just happen. Food is history. Food is geography. Food is the result of centuries of people, movements, and collisions, and Cuba had plenty of all three. Let's start at the very beginning. Cuba sits at the northern edge of the Caribbean, an island roughly the size of Pennsylvania, surrounded by warm tropical waters. That geography alone shapes everything. The climate is hot and humid for most of the year, with a rainy season that turns the countryside into a deep, almost impossible shade of green. The soil is fertile, the sun is relentless. And the growing season? It never really ends. That means Cuba, for most of its history, had access to an extraordinary range of fresh local ingredients. Bananas grew wild and in abundance. Yucca, what much of the world calls cassava or manioc, was practically everywhere. Plantains hung heavy from trees in backyards and countryside farms alike. Corn, sweet potatoes, and tropical fruits like guava, mango, and papaya were part of the landscape before they were ever part of a recipe. This was the foundation, a natural pantry built by the Caribbean itself, but nature was only the first layer. Cuba's food culture is not the product of one people or one tradition. It is a blend, sometimes harmonious, sometimes tense, of at least three major influences that arrived at different moments in history and never fully left. The first is Spain. When Spanish colonizers arrived in the early 16th century, they brought with them a culinary vocabulary that would permanently shape the island. Olive oil, garlic, onions, cumin, oregano, these were the building blocks of Spanish cooking, and they traveled across the Atlantic in ships alongside settlers, priests, and soldiers. The technique of the sofrito, sautéing aromatics in oil as the base of nearly every dish, is a Spanish inheritance that survived every political upheaval Cuba ever faced. It is still there today in almost every Cuban kitchen. The second influence is Africa. This is the part of the story that often goes under-acknowledged, but it cannot be overstated. From the 16th century through the 19th, hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans were brought to Cuba to work the sugar plantations. They came from different regions, primarily West and Central Africa, and they brought their own food traditions with them. Plantains, black-eyed peas, okra, and the technique of frying starchy vegetables in hot oil all have deep roots in African culinary traditions. The African influence shaped not just what Cubans ate, but how food was prepared, seasoned, and shared. And the third influence is the Caribbean itself. Cuba didn't exist in isolation. It was a crossroads, a place where ships stopped, where traders passed through, where influences from neighboring islands, from Mexico, from the broader Latin world, blended into something distinctly Cuban. The use of citrus, especially bitter orange or naranja agria, to marinate meats is a technique that speaks to this regional identity. It's not purely Spanish, it's not purely African, it's Caribbean, it's Cuban. So what did that actually look like on a plate? For most Cubans in the decades before 1959, the daily diet was built around a small number of staple ingredients. Rice and black beans were the non-negotiable center of almost every meal. Pork appeared regularly, more so than beef, which was available but expensive. Plantains, either fried green as tostones or ripe and caramelized, were a constant presence. Yucca, boiled and drizzled with garlic-infused olive oil, showed up as a side dish across the island. It was, by any measure, a cuisine with a strong identity. The flavors were bold, the combinations were deliberate. There was a logic to the diet, a logic built over centuries of adaptation, improvisation, and cultural exchange. But here is where the story gets more complicated, because while Cuban food had a distinct and rich character, the experience of eating in Cuba was not the same for everyone, not even close. A sugarcane worker in the Oriente province and a merchant in Havana might have shared the same national identity, the same language, and even some of the same recipes, but their access to food, the variety on their tables, and the security of knowing where the next meal was coming from, that was a completely different reality. Cuban food was rich in flavor, but it was not equal for everyone. And that tension between abundance and scarcity, between city and countryside, between the privileged plate and the bare one, that tension is at the heart of everything we're going to explore in this documentary. We're just getting started, and there's a lot more on the table. There is a phrase in Cuba that says everything you need to know about the national diet. It doesn't come from a cookbook or a chef's memoir. It comes from the street, from kitchens, from the mouths of grandmothers and farmers and factory workers across the island. Sin arroz y frijoles no hay comida. Without rice and beans, there is no meal. Simple, definitive. And for the vast majority of Cubans living before 1959, completely true. Let's talk about rice first. White rice, plain, steamed, slightly sticky at the bottom of the pot, was the backbone of the Cuban table. It appeared at lunch. It appeared at dinner. In many homes, it appeared at both without anyone questioning it, because questioning it would be like questioning whether the sun would rise. Rice was simply there. It was expected. But how did rice become so central to an island that historically didn't produce large quantities of it locally? The answer, again, comes back to history. Rice arrived in Cuba primarily through Spanish and Asian immigration patterns, as well as through Caribbean trade networks that stretched across the region. By the 20th century, Cuba was importing significant quantities of rice, particularly from the United States, which had become a major trading partner. The economic relationship between Cuba and the U.S. before the Revolution was extensive, and rice was one of the many goods that flowed through that connection. What made rice so dominant wasn't just availability, though. It was adaptability. Rice could be paired with almost anything. It absorbed flavor from whatever was cooked beside it. It stretched a small amount of protein into a full plate. For families with limited resources, rice was the great equalizer. It filled the stomach, it provided energy, and it cost very little. Now add the beans. Black beans, frijoles negros, are perhaps the single most iconic ingredient in Cuban cooking. Slow cooked until soft and creamy, seasoned with garlic, cumin, bay leaf, and a generous amount of the ever-present sofrito, Cuban black beans have a depth of flavor that is almost impossible to achieve quickly. They require patience, they require attention, and in Cuban culture, they received both. The classic combination of white rice and black beans even has its own name, Moros y Cristianos, Moors and Christians. The name is historical, a reference to the centuries-long coexistence and conflict between Muslim Moors and Christian Spaniards on the Iberian Peninsula, brought to the Americas through colonization and eventually absorbed into the culinary vocabulary of Cuba. White and black, side by side on the plate, a name that carries the weight of history in every spoonful. There was also a variation, arroz moro or congri in the eastern provinces, where the rice and beans were cooked together in the same pot, the beans lending their deep color and flavor directly to the grains. In Havana and the West, the two were more often served separately. This regional difference, seemingly small, actually tells you something important about how Cuban identity varied across the island. Same country, different plates, different traditions. Why were rice and beans so dominant? Part of the answer is economic. Both ingredients were inexpensive. Beans could be bought dried in bulk and stored for long periods. Rice was widely available and easy to prepare in large quantities. For working-class families, which represented the majority of Cuba's population, These two ingredients offered the most nutrition per peso spent. But the relationship between Cubans and rice and beans wasn't purely practical. It was emotional. It was cultural. It was identity. A plate of rice and beans in Cuba carries with it the memory of a grandmother's kitchen, the smell of a slow Saturday afternoon, the sound of a radio playing son cubano in the background while someone stirs the pot. Food memory is powerful anywhere in the world, but in Cuba, an island where so much has been lost, displaced, and interrupted by history, the constancy of rice and beans became something almost sacred. It was the one thing that didn't change. But let's be precise about something. When we say that rice and beans were the foundation of the Cuban diet before 1959, we are describing a broad pattern, and broad patterns always have exceptions at both ends. At the lower end, there were families, particularly in rural areas and among the poorest urban communities, for whom even this basic combination was not always guaranteed. A bad harvest, a period of unemployment, a family too large for its income. These realities meant that the plate was sometimes even simpler than rice and beans. Sometimes it was just rice. Sometimes it was just beans with a piece of bread. Sometimes, in the hardest moments, it was less than that. At the upper end, wealthy Cuban families ate rice and beans too, because the dish was genuinely delicious and deeply embedded in national identity. But they ate it alongside far more: roast pork, grilled fish, imported wines, a variety of side dishes that transformed the humble bean and rice combination into one component of a much larger, more abundant table. This spectrum, from bare subsistence to comfortable abundance, existed simultaneously across the island, often within the same city, sometimes within the same neighborhood. And yet, the beans kept cooking. There is something quietly powerful about that image. In a country defined by inequality, by the vast gap between the sugar baron and the cane cutter, by the distance between the Havana Hotel and the rural Bohio, the black beans simmered in the same way in every kitchen, the same aromatics, the same patience, the same result. Food has a way of crossing lines that politics cannot. The rice and beans of pre-revolutionary Cuba were not just a meal, they were a statement of continuity. A shared language spoken across class lines, even when so much else divided people. But that continuity had its limits. Because as we move further into this story, we'll see that the table in Cuba was never truly equal, and nowhere was that more visible than when we look at what else was on it. Specifically, the meat. Picture a Sunday afternoon in Havana, sometime in the early 1950s. In a middle-class neighborhood, the smell coming from an open kitchen window is unmistakable: garlic, citrus, and slow-roasting pork. The family has been preparing since the night before, marinating the meat in mojo, that distinctly Cuban combination of bitter orange juice, garlic, oregano, and olive oil, letting the flavors work their way deep into the flesh overnight. By midday, the house smells like a celebration. Now picture a different Sunday in a small rural community in the Oriente province, a few hundred kilometers to the east. The table here is simpler: rice, beans, maybe some boiled yuca. Meat, if it appears at all, is a small piece, a garnish, almost, not the centerpiece. The family eats well enough. But the Sunday roast? That is not part of this week's reality. Same country, same Sunday, completely different tables. Let's start with what Cuba actually had. Before the revolution, Cuba was not a food-poor country in terms of raw production. The island had a functioning agricultural economy that included meaningful livestock production. Cattle ranches, fincas ganaderas, operated across the island, particularly in the central and eastern provinces where the land was well suited for grazing. Pigs were raised widely, both on larger farms and in the backyards of rural homes, where a family pig was a practical investment, a walking food reserve that would eventually become a lechon asado at Christmas or a special occasion. Chickens were common, Fish and seafood were available along the coastlines, and Cuba, being an island, has a lot of coastline. Freshwater fish came from rivers and lakes in the interior. Shellfish, particularly lobster and shrimp, existed in abundance in Cuban waters. On paper, the protein supply was there. The question was never really about production. It was about distribution, about who could afford what, about how a country with real agricultural wealth managed to leave so many of its people with so little of it on their plates. Pork was the great equalizer, to a point. If there was one meat that crossed class lines more than any other in pre-revolutionary Cuba, it was pork. Cerdo. The pig was everywhere. It was cheaper than beef, easier to raise in small spaces, and deeply embedded in the culinary traditions brought over from Spain and reinforced by centuries of Cuban practice. Lechon asado, whole roasted pig, slow-cooked over an open fire or in a traditional caja china, a wooden roasting box, was the undisputed king of Cuban celebrations. Weddings, Christmas Eve, Noche Buena, New Year's, baptisms, quinceañeras, any event significant enough to gather the extended family around a table almost certainly involved a whole pig at some point during the proceedings. The preparation was an event in itself. The pig would be marinated for hours, sometimes overnight, in a generous mojo, that signature Cuban marinade of bitter orange, garlic, cumin, and oregano. It would be turned slowly over the fire, the skin gradually tightening and crisping into the deep golden crackling that Cubans call cuirito, arguably the most prized part of the whole animal. The smell alone was enough to pull neighbors out of their homes. For working class and even poor Cuban families, pork was the meat most likely to appear on the table. Not every day, but with some regularity, especially during the festive calendar. A family that couldn't afford beef might still manage a piece of pork on a Sunday, or save up for the lechon that would mark the end of the year. Beef was a different story entirely. Cuba had cattle, Cuba had ranches, Cuba even had a beef industry with some capacity for export. And yet, for a significant portion of the Cuban population, beef was not a routine food. It was aspirational. The reasons were economic and structural. Beef production in Cuba, while present, was not as developed or as efficient as it was in countries like Argentina or Brazil. The cattle industry was concentrated in the hands of relatively few large landowners, and the price of beef at market reflected that concentration. A cut of beef cost considerably more than an equivalent amount of pork or chicken, placing it out of comfortable reach for the rural poor and the urban working class. What beef did exist on the Cuban table at this level came often in the form of cheaper cuts, tougher, less desirable pieces that required long, slow cooking to become tender and edible. And from that necessity came one of Cuba's most celebrated dishes, ropa vieja. The name translates literally as old clothes, a reference to the shredded, ragged appearance of the meat after it has been braised low and slow until the fibers break apart completely. The beef is then pulled by hand and cooked again in a rich tomato-based sauce with peppers, onions, garlic, cumin, and sometimes a splash of white wine. The result is a dish of extraordinary depth, complex, savory, deeply satisfying, that began, at its root, as a way to make a tough, cheap cut of meat not just edible, but genuinely delicious. Ropa vieja is a perfect example of what food historians call cocina povera, the cooking of the poor, where necessity drives creativity and the limitations of the pantry become the birthplace of something memorable. Cuba has many such dishes, but none carry quite the same iconic weight as the shredded beef stew that would eventually become synonymous with Cuban cuisine around the world. The contrast stated plainly. By the 1950s, Cuba had a clear and visible stratification when it came to meat consumption. The wealthy and upper middle classes in cities like Havana ate beef with regularity. They could afford the better cuts, bistec de res, grilled steaks, slow-braised roses. They had access to butchers in well-stocked urban markets to restaurants that served full meat-centered menus, to a food culture that included protein as a given at every meal. The urban working class ate pork when they could, chicken occasionally, and relied on beans and rice as their primary protein source on the days when meat didn't appear. They ate well by some measures. They ate incompletely by others. And the rural poor, particularly the sugarcane workers, the guajiros, the families living on the margins of the plantation economy, often ate meat only on special occasions. Their diet was built on what was local, cheap, and storable: rice, beans, root vegetables, a small piece of pork fat used to flavor a pot rather than to feed a plate. Same country, completely different plates. That phrase keeps returning because it has to, because it is the truth of pre-revolutionary Cuba that the revolution itself would later use to justify everything that came after. The inequality at the Cuban table was not hidden. It was visible, daily, undeniable. A child growing up on a sugar plantation in the 1940s and a child growing up in a Havana apartment building lived in many ways in different food realities. One knew the smell of lechon as a once-a-year event. The other knew it as a regular Sunday ritual. Food inequality in Cuba before 1959 was not a secret. It was a wound. And wounds, when left untreated long enough, have a way of changing everything. There is something almost contradictory about Cuba in the years before 1959. On one hand, you have an island of extraordinary natural richness, a place where fruit falls from trees without asking, where the soil produces with almost reckless generosity, where the sea offers protein in abundance and the sun never truly disappears. On the other hand, you have a population where millions of people did not eat enough, where the harvest was plentiful, but the distribution was broken, where the land produced wealth that concentrated in few hands while the hands that worked it went home to an empty plate. That contradiction is the story of pre-revolutionary Cuba. And nowhere is it more visible than when you look at the foods that were most abundant on the island and ask who actually got to enjoy them. Start with the tropics themselves. Cuba's climate produced an almost embarrassing variety of fresh food. Bananas and plantains grew in such abundance that they were practically a currency of their own in rural areas. Green plantains fried into tostones, ripe plantains caramelized in oil into maduros, boiled plantains mashed into fufu with garlic and pork fat. Every stage of the plantain's ripeness had a corresponding Cuban preparation, and every preparation was delicious in its own distinct way. Yuca, cassava, was another cornerstone of the tropical Cuban diet. Boiled until soft and served with mojo criollo, that warm drizzle of garlic sautéed in olive oil with bitter orange, yuca was humble, but deeply satisfying. It was the kind of food that required almost nothing to become something. A pot of water, a few cloves of garlic, a splash of citrus, and suddenly a root pulled from the ground became a dish worth remembering. Corn appeared in various forms: roasted, boiled, ground into tamales, or cooked into harina de maíz, a thick cornmeal porridge that served as a filling and affordable meal, particularly in rural areas. Sweet potatoes, malanga, boniato, the island's array of root vegetables, formed a quiet but essential layer of the Cuban diet that often goes unrecognized in more glamorous accounts of the cuisine. And the fruit. The fruit alone could fill an entire chapter. Mangoes in season were so plentiful that people grew tired of them, a remarkable statement for anyone who has ever eaten a perfectly ripe Cuban mango, warm from the sun, juice running down the wrist. Guava, papaya, coconut, pineapple, tamarind, starfruit. The tropical calendar rolled through a succession of flavors that no imported grocery store could ever fully replicate. This was the natural abundance of Cuba. And for the rural population that lived closest to the land, this abundance was real and tangible, even when other parts of the diet were lacking. You might not have meat on your table every day, but in season, you had fruit, you had roots, you had the land itself feeding you in ways that no economic system could entirely suppress. Now let's talk about coffee. If rice and beans were the foundation of the Cuban meal, coffee was the foundation of the Cuban day. And not in the casual, optional way that coffee functions in some cultures. In Cuba, coffee was infrastructure. It was the first thing in the morning and the punctuation mark between every social interaction. It was the reason to sit down with a neighbor, the gesture of welcome when someone arrived at your door, the ritual that marked the transition from work to rest. Cuban coffee, café cubano, is not the diluted, filtered brew of other traditions. It is espresso strength, dense and intensely aromatic, pulled short and served in a small cup with a generous amount of sugar already stirred into the grounds before brewing. The result is a thick, sweet, almost syrupy drink with a foam on top called espuma, created by vigorously beating the first drops of coffee with sugar until it forms a pale, caramel-colored froth. Cuba was, before 1959, a significant coffee-producing nation. The mountains of the Sierra Maestra in the eastern provinces and the Escambray Range in the center of the island offered the altitude, rainfall, and shade conditions that coffee plants love. Cuban coffee had a reputation for quality, and the domestic consumption matched the domestic pride. Coffee connected people. It was the social lubricant of Cuban life. In the cities, in the countryside, in the factories, and in the fields. A worker starting a shift at a sugar mill and a lawyer arriving at his Havana office both began their morning the same way. A small, strong, sweet cup of café cubano. In that moment, at least, the distance between their worlds narrowed to the width of a coffee cup. And then there was sugar. Sugar is the element of Cuban history that explains almost everything else. The economy, the social structure, the racial composition of the population, the inequality we have been tracing throughout this documentary, and ultimately, the political rupture that would change the country forever. Cuba was, for most of the 19th and early 20th centuries, the world's largest producer of sugar. The entire island was organized at a structural level around the production of cane. The latifundios, vast sugar plantations, dominated the landscape and the economy. The cities that grew up around them, the railroads that connected them, the ports that exported their product, the banks that financed their operations, all of it existed in service of sugar, and Cubans ate sugar abundantly, enthusiastically, unavoidably. Sugar appeared in the coffee, of course, always, generously, non-negotiably. It appeared in desserts like arroz con leche, a creamy rice pudding fragrant with cinnamon and lemon zest. In flan, the silky caramel custard inherited from Spain and adopted with full Cuban commitment. In coquimol, in dulce de leche, in mariquitas glazed with cane syrup, in the countless small sweets sold from carts on Havana's streets. Sugar was perhaps the one food product that was genuinely accessible across the full spectrum of Cuban society. Even the poorest families could afford sugar because Cuba produced so much of it that the domestic price was low. A worker who could barely afford protein could still sweeten his coffee, could still offer his children a piece of sugar cane to chew on a hot afternoon, could still make a simple syrup-soaked dessert for a Sunday gathering. There is a bitter irony in that, of course. The very product whose production had driven centuries of slavery, exploitation, and inequality, the crop that had broken the backs of generations of Cuban workers, was the one thing the system made universally affordable. Sugar was everywhere. And it was, in a deeply complicated way, one of the few democratized pleasures in a profoundly undemocratic society. The rum deserves its moment, too. Ron Cubano, Cuban rum, was not merely a drink. It was a cultural artifact, a point of national pride, and a fixture of social life across the island. Distilled from sugar cane molasses, aged in oak barrels, Cuban rum developed a distinctive smoothness that set it apart from the rougher spirits of other Caribbean producers. By the mid-20th century, brands like Bacardi, founded in Santiago de Cuba in 1862, had made Cuban rum internationally famous. But the relationship between Cubans and rum was never purely commercial. The mojito, built on white rum, fresh mint, lime sugar, and sparkling water, was being drunk in Havana bars long before Ernest Hemingway made it famous to the outside world. The daiquiri, the Cuba Libre, the simple glass of aged rum poured neat at the end of a long day. These were the rhythms of Cuban social life, inseparable from the music, the conversation, and the particular quality of heat that settled over the island on summer evenings. And then came 1959. Everything we have described in this documentary, the rice and beans, the slow-roasted pork, the tropical abundance, the strong sweet coffee, the rum and the sugar, and the inequality that ran beneath all of it like an underground river, all of it existed within a specific historical window, a Cuba that was imperfect, deeply unequal, and yet culinarily alive in ways that would not survive what came next. When Fidel Castro's revolutionary forces entered Havana in January 1959, the political transformation was immediate and total. Within months, the new government began nationalizing industries, redistributing land, and restructuring the economy along socialist lines. The United States, Cuba's largest trading partner, responded with an embargo that would tighten progressively over the following years, cutting off the supply of imported goods that had supplemented the Cuban diet, including, critically, large quantities of rice, cooking oil, and other staples. Rationing arrived in 1962. The libreta, the ration book, became one of the defining objects of Cuban daily life, a document that determined not just what a family could eat, but how much and when. The variety that had characterized even the modest Cuban table began to shrink. The gap between city and countryside, in some ways, narrowed. But it narrowed downward toward uniformity rather than abundance. The lechon at Christmas became harder to prepare. The coffee, once grown on Cuban hillsides and consumed with unrestricted enthusiasm, became a rationed commodity mixed with chicory to stretch the supply. The tropical fruits remained because the trees didn't know about politics, but the broader food culture, the living, evolving, richly layered cuisine that had been centuries in the making, entered a long period of compression and constraint. This is not a political judgment. The revolution promised, and in some areas delivered, greater equality. The child of a sugarcane worker gained access to education and health care that had been unthinkable before 1959. The most brutal extremes of the pre-revolutionary inequality were addressed, at least in formal terms, but the table changed permanently. The food culture that we have spent this documentary exploring, that specific combination of Spanish technique, African soul, Caribbean ingredients, and Cuban improvisation, that culture was frozen at a particular moment, like a photograph taken just before the light changed. And that photograph is what this documentary has been trying to show you, because food is never just food. It is memory. It is identity. It is the accumulated result of everything a people has survived, adapted to, and made beautiful. The black beans simmering on a Havana stove in 1955, the lechon turning slowly over coals on Christmas Eve, the small cup of sweet, strong coffee passed between neighbors over a low fence on a Tuesday morning, the mango eaten standing in a backyard, juice on the chin, no plate required. These were the textures of Cuban life before the revolution, imperfect, unequal, sometimes insufficient, but alive, deeply, unmistakably, irreversibly alive. The way Cubans ate was about to change forever, and now you know what they were eating before it did.